They done took down Puff. They done took down all these other powerful black people. Jay Z's like the lone standing powerful black man.
You do the track wrestling on them. Jay is them people.
But I know they went up to the feds one day and they took some paperwork up there to him.
Let's be very clear. This is the email that DJ Vlad sent me, his producer sent me, asking me to appear on his podcast on YouTube just after the Cassie video was released on my birthday.
But like, where's Jay at? He's mad quiet. Like while the Puffy thing was going on. But it's obvious now that his team was being made aware that he was in those allegations also. You know, so I hope it works out, because with his family, the things that go on internally is...
For years, the loudest silence in hip-hop didn't come from the streets, the charts, or the boardrooms. It came from 50 Cent. No rants. No memes. No nuclear captions. And when that man goes quiet for that long, it's never because he has nothing to say. It's because he's waiting. Now the internet is buzzing with one terrifying question. Did 50 just decide the clock finally ran out on Diddy and Jay Z? According to viral chatter, the gloves are off. The jokes are sharper. The tone is colder. And the just trolling defense suddenly feels a little too thin. People are rewinding old interviews, replaying old laughs, and realizing some of those jokes might have been warnings in disguise. This isn't a diss track moment. This is a post-game interview after years of scoreboard watching. Because when 50 speaks now, it doesn't sound emotional. It sounds calculated. This makes the Kardashians look subtle. This makes industry beef look like playground drama. Because if even a fraction of what's being implied is real, this isn't about ego. This is about power, protection, and secrets that survived by staying quiet. And the scariest part? 50 doesn't sound angry. He sounds done waiting. And once you understand why he chose now, who he's pointing at without naming names, and what the internet thinks he's finally exposing, you'll realize this isn't a moment. It's a countdown for a long time. The most unsettling thing about 50 Cent wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. This is a man who built an entire second career on trolling billionaires, executives, rappers, and anyone else who breathed too loud around him. So when the loudest instigator in hip-hop suddenly went quiet about two of the most powerful names in the industry, people noticed. Silence from 50 isn't peace, it's storage. He doesn't forget, he archives Diddy and Jay Z didn't just rise to the top of hip-hop. They built empires so polished they almost look untouchable. One mastered the art of reinvention, turning culture into currency and parties into mythology. The other perfected the billionaire blueprint, transforming bars into boardrooms and lyrics into legacy. For years, they moved like final bosses, too big to challenge, too connected to corner. And 50? He watched, quietly, patiently, like someone waiting for the room to empty before speaking clearly. What made the recent chatter explode wasn't a single explosive statement. It was a shift in tone. Fans started noticing that 50's jokes weren't random anymore. The humor felt sharper, colder, and more deliberate. The punchlines landed with less laughter and more side-eye. Old comments resurfaced that once sounded like harmless trolling, but now felt timed. People began asking whether those jokes were always placeholders for something heavier. The background matters here, because 50's history with power in hip-hop is complicated. He's been burned by executives, outplayed by boardrooms, and forced to learn the rules the hard way. That experience rewired him. He stopped reacting emotionally and started moving strategically. When someone like that watches empires grow unchecked, he doesn't rush to expose. He waits for leverage, timing, and audience readiness. The internet started rewinding history like a crime documentary binge. Old interviews where 50 laughed off industry politics suddenly felt layered. Comments about loyalty, silence, and survival took on new meaning. Fans noticed how often he referenced knowing too much without elaborating. That ambiguity became fuel, because ambiguity invites imagination. And imagination does not play fair. What really lit the fuse was how casual the alleged exposure felt. No dramatic announcement. No capital letter meltdown. Just calculated commentary that sounded less like anger and more like reflection. That scared people. Angry men rant. Calm men reveal. And 50 sounded calm in a way that suggested he wasn't chasing attention. He was correcting a record he felt had been misfiled for years. The first reactions were split but intense. Some dismissed it as classic 50 behavior, another round of trolling dressed up as wisdom. Others weren't so quick to laugh. They pointed out that 50 rarely revisits topics unless there's unfinished business. He doesn't reopen chapters unless he plans to read them out loud. That pattern made the situation feel less like a joke and more like a warning. Diddy and Jay Z's names carry weight for a reason. They represent power structures, alliances, and a version of hip-hop success that thrives behind closed doors. Questioning that power, even indirectly, feels dangerous in an industry built on favors and silence. So when 50 appeared to nudge those names back into conversation, people leaned in. Because challenges at that level don't happen accidentally. Social media did what it always does when a powerful narrative cracks. It stitched together timelines, clipped interviews, and froze frames on moments that once passed unnoticed. People began asking whether certain industry stories had been protected by reputation rather than truth. Not accusing, not proving, just questioning. And questioning alone was enough to make the conversation radioactive. The sarcasm online was ruthless but telling. Memes compared the situation to a chess game where the quietest piece suddenly threatens the king. Others joked that 50 had been charging interest on silence for years and was finally ready to collect. The humor masked discomfort. Because beneath the jokes was a realization that power survives longest, when no one dares to narrate it differently. What added to the tension was the absence of immediate response. No fiery denials. No dramatic clapbacks. Just continued movement, continued silence, continued business as usual. In hip-hop, that kind of calm can either mean there's nothing to worry about, or there's everything to protect. The internet, of course, chose the more entertaining interpretation. This wasn't framed as an expose with receipts laid out on a table. It felt more like a door being cracked open just enough for light to spill through. 50 wasn't pointing fingers, he was pointing attention. And attention is dangerous when it lands on people who are used to controlling it. The most unsettling part was how believable the timing felt. Hip-hop is in a moment of reevaluation. Old icons are being re-examined, legacies are being debated, and the audience is less willing to accept mythology without context. In that climate, even subtle commentary can feel seismic. 50 didn't create the tension. He walked into it at exactly the right moment. As fans debated motives, one theory kept resurfacing. Maybe this wasn't about revenge or ego at all. Maybe this was about legacy control. 50 understands how narratives get frozen in time, how history gets written by the loudest survivors. Speaking now when audiences are skeptical and curious gives him maximum impact with minimal effort. The conversation shifted from, "What did he say?" to "Why now?" That question haunted the discourse. Because timing reveals intention more than words ever could. Waiting years to speak suggests calculation. Calculation suggests confidence. And confidence suggests someone believes the truth, or at least their version of it, can survive daylight. By the end of this phase, nothing had been conclusively proven, named, or exposed in the legal sense. But something far more disruptive had happened. The illusion of permanent untouchability cracked. People realized that even the most powerful figures exist within narratives that can be challenged if the challenger understands timing better than fear. This wasn't a declaration of war. It was a reminder that wars don't always start with gunfire. Sometimes they start with a sentence that lands too calmly to ignore. 50 didn't sound like someone seeking chaos. He sounded like someone reminding the room that silence is a choice. And choices can always be revisited, and that's why this moment felt dangerous. Not because of what was said, but because of what was implied. The story wasn't finished. It was just finally being told differently. Once the tone shifted, the internet did what it always does when it smells blood in the water. It circled. What started as subtle commentary suddenly became a full-blown scavenger hunt, with fans, bloggers, and podcasters digging through decades of footage like they were mining for hidden messages. The story stopped being about what 50 Cent said and turned into what everyone thought he meant, which is far more dangerous in a culture fueled by implication. The first real escalation came from how fast old moments were reinterpreted. Clips that once played as jokes suddenly felt like breadcrumbs. Interviews where 50 laughed off. Industry politics were replayed with captions asking whether he was laughing because he knew something everyone else didn't. Even throwaway comments from years ago started trending again, stripped of context and reinserted into a narrative that felt newly urgent. Memes hit the timeline like artillery. Some compared 50 to a retired mob boss narrating a documentary from the shadows, calmly explaining how the game really works once you're no longer afraid of it. Others joked that Diddy and Jay Z had spent years building castles while 50 was quietly counting bricks. The humor was savage, but it carried an edge. Because jokes land harder when they feel plausible. Celebrity reactions didn't clarify anything, but they absolutely added fuel. Vague posts about truth coming out, history being rewritten, and protecting your legacy appeared right on schedule. Nobody named names, but nobody had to. Fans treated every ambiguous caption like a coded message, assigning alliances and motives with the confidence of conspiracy theorists who had already decided the ending. Podcasts went into overdrive. Entire episodes were dedicated to breaking down tone, timing, and subtext. Hosts debated whether 50 was exposing anything at all or simply reminding people that power doesn't equal innocence. Others argued that this was less about revelation and more about reframing, about shifting how audiences view figures they've been conditioned to admire without question. The outrage wasn't explosive. It was cumulative. There were no riots in comment sections, just a steady hum of skepticism growing louder by the day. Fans began questioning why certain stories had always died quietly, why some rumors never gained traction, and why some names seemed immune to scrutiny no matter how often whispers surfaced. The conversation didn't accuse, it doubted. And doubt spreads faster than certainty. What made this phase especially volatile was how it intersected with a broader cultural moment. Hip-hop, like every other industry, is being re-examined under modern standards. Audiences are more willing to interrogate legacies and less willing to accept mythology as fact. In that climate, even a nudge from someone like 50 Cent feels like permission to ask uncomfortable questions out loud. Diddy and Jay Z's continued composure only intensified the speculation. No dramatic responses. No emotional defenses. Just business as usual, which some interpreted as confidence and others as insulation. In an industry where image management is an art form, calm can read as control or concealment depending on the viewer's bias. The lack of visible reaction didn't end the conversation, it prolonged it. The pop culture comparisons got wild. People likened the situation to a prestige drama, where the final season reveals that the narrator has been unreliable the whole time. Others compared it to chess matches where the player who never touches the board is actually winning. Absurd comparisons, sure, but effective. Because they captured the feeling that something long-standing was being quietly questioned. What really pushed the story into a new tier was how fans started connecting dots across eras. Business moves, partnerships, and public alliances were suddenly scrutinized with fresh suspicion. Not accused, not condemned, just re-examined. The internet wasn't claiming to know the truth. It was acknowledging that it might not have known the whole story either. 50's own demeanor throughout this phase kept the tension tight. He didn't escalate emotionally. He didn't chase headlines. He let the discourse breathe, which made it feel intentional. Every pause felt like strategy. Every non-response felt like confidence. In a culture addicted to instant gratification, restraint reads as power. Critics tried to shut it down by calling it clout chasing or recycled beef, but that argument didn't stick the way it usually does. The difference here was age, timing, and credibility. 50 isn't an up-and-comer trying to trend. He's an established figure with nothing obvious to gain from stirring old waters. That reality made people wonder why he would bother unless he believed the moment could sustain it. The public outrage never fully tipped into chaos. And that's what made it scarier. There were no mass unfollows, no viral cancellations. Just a steady erosion of blind reverence. People didn't stop respecting Diddy or Jay Z overnight, but they stopped treating them as beyond question. That shift is subtle, but it's seismic. As days passed, the conversation broadened beyond individuals. It became about how power operates in hip-hop, how silence can be currency, and how narratives are protected by alliances rather than facts. 50 wasn't positioned as a hero or a villain. He was positioned as a catalyst, someone who nudged a door open and let the audience decide how far to push it. By the end of this phase, the story had fully escaped its original spark. It was no longer about a joke, a comment, or a post. It was about the fragility of untouchable status in an era that thrives on reevaluation. The audience didn't demand answers. It demanded awareness. Nothing concrete had been revealed, and yet everything felt different. The names were the same. The power structures remained intact. But the illusion of permanence had taken a hit. People realized that silence doesn't erase questions, it just delays them. This wasn't the climax. It was the pressure building before it. And pressure, when ignored long enough, always finds a way to release. After the internet finished replaying every clip, decoding every pause and turning implication into entertainment, the story slid into its most revealing phase. Not the loud phase. The lasting one. This is where narratives don't explode. They settle, and once they settle, they quietly reshape how people see everything that comes next. What 50 Cent set in motion didn't end with a punchline. It ended with a recalibration of perception. And perception is the one currency that never devalues. Diddy and Jay Z didn't suddenly fall from grace. And that's exactly the point. Empires don't collapse on social media timelines, they adjust behind closed doors. What changed wasn't their status, it was the lens. Audiences who once accepted polished mythology without question began watching with a fraction more skepticism. Not accusation, not condemnation, just awareness. And awareness is dangerous because it doesn't need proof to linger. It only needs memory. For 50 Cent, the aftermath looked less like victory and more like confirmation. He didn't celebrate. He didn't escalate. He let the conversation breathe, which made it feel deliberate rather than reactionary. That restraint told its own story. It suggested this was never about a viral moment. It was about repositioning himself as someone who sees the board clearly and speaks only when the room is ready to hear it. The public perception of 50 shifted subtly but significantly. He stopped being framed as just the industry troll and started being viewed as an unreliable narrator with reliable instincts. That contradiction gave his words more weight, not less. People may not trust every joke, but they trust patterns. And his pattern of waiting, watching, and then speaking has proven effective too many times to ignore. Diddy's image absorbed the scrutiny in a familiar way. Through composure, calm appearances, steady business moves, and the continuation of normalcy communicated confidence to some and insulation to others. In an era where outrage often demands immediate response, choosing not to react became its own message. That message wasn't interpreted uniformly, but it didn't need to be. The ambiguity kept the conversation alive without escalating it into chaos. J-Z single quotes S reputation, built on strategy and silence, was impacted differently. He has always been associated with control, foresight, and the ability to stay several moves ahead. In this context, that same silence read as either mastery or distance, depending on the viewer. For some, it reinforced his image as untouchable. For others, it highlighted how power can remain unbothered even when questions circulate. What became clear was that the story never needed a dramatic reveal to do damage or make change. It needed patience. The kind of patience that allows doubts to mature into conversations and conversations to evolve into cultural memory. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about disrupting certainty. And certainty is the foundation of every legacy. The industry response followed a familiar pattern of quiet recalibration. No public feuds. No official statements. Just subtle shifts in how people spoke, referenced history, and framed influence. In rooms where reputations are currency, even a slight devaluation is noticed. People don't announce when they reassess alliances. They simply behave differently, and those differences compound over time. For fans, the aftermath brought an uncomfortable realization. Idealization thrives on simplicity, and this moment introduced complexity. It reminded audiences that legends are also participants in systems, and systems are rarely clean. That realization didn't erase admiration, but it complicated it. And complication is the enemy of blind loyalty. The lack of closure frustrated some viewers, but it also made the story more durable. There was no final chapter to argue over, no definitive statement to accept or reject. Instead, there was a lingering sense that something had shifted without being named. Unnamed shifts are the hardest to reverse, because they live in feeling rather than fact. What lingered most was the question of timing. Why now? Why after years of silence? Why when the culture is already questioning power, accountability, and legacy? That alignment made the moment feel less accidental and more inevitable. It suggested that 50 didn't create the opportunity, he recognized it. And recognition is a form of intelligence the internet respects. As weeks passed, the conversation stopped trending but didn't disappear. It resurfaced in side comments, podcast tangents, and debates about hip-hop history. The story became a reference point. Remember when that carried weight beyond its original context. Reference points shape narratives. Long after headlines fade, the most revealing outcome was how little had to be said to create impact. No accusations were formally made. No dossiers were released. And yet the discourse changed. That alone demonstrated how fragile untouchable status can be when culture shifts and audiences mature. Power survives best when it adapts, not when it pretends questions don't exist. For 50 Cent, the moment solidified his role as a disruptor who doesn't need to shout to be heard. For Diddy and Jay Z, it reinforced the reality that even the most polished legacies exist in conversation with the public, not above it. For the audience, it was a reminder that silence can be strategic, but it can also be interpreted, and interpretation is not always controllable. Nothing ended with a bang. There was no final verdict, no dramatic fallout. Instead, there was something far more enduring, a shift in how stories are told and received. The room didn't explode. It leaned forward, and that is the most dangerous position of all, because when people lean in, they're not looking for noise. They're looking for truth, or at least a version of it that feels closer than the one they were given before. The countdown didn't stop. It simply stopped ticking out loud. The silence returned. But it felt different this time. Heavier, charged. And everyone understood one thing very clearly. When someone like 50 Cent speaks after years of quiet, it's not to end a story. It's to remind you that some chapters were always being saved for later. Now don't sit there acting like this was just another internet rumor you'll forget by tomorrow. Moments like this don't hit because they're loud. They hit because they feel calculated. And if this story made you pause, rewind, or suddenly side-eye hip-hop history a little harder, then yeah, that's the point. So let's make it official. Smash that like button like it's been hiding the truth in plain sight for years. Hit subscribe like you just realized silence can be louder than any diss track. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Because this is one of those conversations where everybody thinks they know the story, but nobody agrees on the ending. Do you think 50 is finally pulling the curtain back? Or is this the cleanest mind game hip-hop has seen in decades? Say it with your chest. Remember, scandals don't always come with paperwork and press conferences. Sometimes they show up as jokes that land too accurately, pauses that feel intentional, and timing that's a little too perfect to ignore. While other channels chase quick clicks and forget by next week, we stay breaking down the patterns, the power plays, and the moments that quietly rewrite legacy. This isn't about canceling legends or crowning villains. It's about asking the questions that were never supposed to be asked out loud. And once those questions exist, they don't disappear just because the timeline moves on. So stay locked in. Stay skeptical. Stay curious, because the next revelation is never announced ahead of time. The next silence might mean more than the last 10 interviews combined. And when that moment hits, you already know where to be. This story isn't over. It's just finally being heard.